the first whisper of the myth. They say there are stories that are born to endure, that float through the pages of time like a persistent echo that refuses to die. Stories that, generation after generation, continue to captivate those who hear them, as if they had a life of their own. Atlantis is one of those stories. It does not matter how many centuries go by, how much evidence is missing, or how many contradictory theories pile up. Its legend remains there, defying logic and fueling the imagination of millions. But to understand how it all began, we must travel through time. Far back, all the way to classical Greece, when a single man, seated in front of his wax tablet, decided to tell something that would forever change the way the world would understand the past and the mystery. Plato, philosopher, thinker, politician, but above all, a storyteller who, under the guise of intellectual dialogue, hid warnings, metaphors, and symbols meant to provoke reflection. It was the 4th century before Christ, and Athens was living through one of the most turbulent times in its history. Wars, political tensions, and the questioning of traditional values painted the backdrop of a society in full transformation. In that context, Plato began writing his dialogues, a series of works in which he used conversations between characters to express his philosophical ideas. It was in 2 of those dialogues that, for the first time, the world heard the name Atlantis, the first known as the Timaeus, and the second, the Critias. Both texts are not works of fiction in the modern sense. They were rather philosophical exercises, vehicles to convey teachings about ethics, politics, and the nature of man. But that did not prevent Plato from drawing, in the midst of deep reflections on the cosmos and virtue, the portrait of a civilization as advanced as it was doomed. According to the narrative, the story would have reached Plato through Solon, the famous Athenian legislator who, during a journey to Egypt, would have heard from the mouth of some priests the account of an ancient power that, many thousands of years earlier, had challenged Athens. The priests, guardians of a knowledge far older than that of the Greeks, spoke of an island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, that geographic point we now identify as the Strait of Gibraltar. A rich, powerful land with colossal armies and temples of dazzling splendor, but also corrupted by its own arrogance. Plato did not spare any details. He presented Atlantis as a civilization that had reached levels of sophistication unimaginable for its time. A culture that mastered engineering, architecture, and art, and that had built canals, ports, and palaces covered in precious metals. But along with greatness came decadence. The narrative advances, showing how the Atlanteans, intoxicated by power, began to expand violently, trying to subjugate all known peoples. Only Athens, young and virtuous, resisted that onslaught. The outcome left no room for doubt. As divine punishment for its arrogance, Atlantis disappeared in a single day and night of misfortune. Earthquakes and tsunamis erased it from the map, submerging it forever beneath the ocean waters. What could have remained as a simple allegorical example of the consequences of corruption and ambition began to take on an unexpected dimension. The way Plato told the story, his level of detail, and his insistence that all of it was real caused readers, centuries later, to wonder whether perhaps, behind the moral lesson, there was a forgotten truth. But did Plato truly want us to believe in the literal existence of Atlantis? This is where the debate begins. Some scholars argue that his story was nothing more than a didactic construction, a sort of political fable to criticize the decadence of Athens and praise the virtues of an ideal republic. According to this interpretation, Atlantis would be just the dark mirror of what could happen if a society fell into moral corruption and despotism. However, others cling to Plato's exact words. In his dialogues, the philosopher makes it clear that the story he tells is true, transmitted by trustworthy sources and based on real events that occurred thousands of years earlier. That statement has been, for more than 2 millennia, the fuel for theories, investigations, and obsessions. Why would a thinker as meticulous as Plato include such an elaborate invention without warning of its fictitious nature? That question remains unanswered. Furthermore, it must be remembered that Plato was a defender of geometry, mathematics, and cosmic harmony. His way of understanding the world was based on the balance between myth and reason. For this reason, some believe that even though his story has a mythological wrapping, it could be based on more ancient oral traditions, distorted memories of real catastrophes, or even geographic reports passed on by travelers from remote times. Atlantis did not appear in the work of any other author of his time. Not Aristotle, his direct student, nor other great Greek thinkers took up the story. This detail has led many to believe that the tale had no purpose beyond the philosophical. But even that silence has fed the mystery. Because human beings are like that. When something remains in the shadows, the imagination takes over. Of course, in the Athens of the 4th century before Christ, Plato's texts circulated among an intellectual elite. They were not popular stories accessible to everyone. They were complex texts, written to provoke reflection and debate among students and philosophers. No one at that time could have anticipated that, centuries later, that story contained in just a few pages would become a global obsession, inspiring maps, expeditions, and debates that would cross borders and eras. And while Plato continued writing other dialogues, never again mentioning Atlantis, the story remained dormant. For centuries it would stay that way, hidden among other more influential texts. Not even classical commentators gave it much importance. But like every good myth, what remains asleep is not dead. It only waits for the moment to awaken again. The story of Atlantis was only just beginning. What began as a philosophical whisper would soon become a roar that would echo across entire civilizations. Plato's detailed account. If there is one moment in the story of Atlantis that immediately transports the reader's imagination to exotic landscapes and monumental cities, it is precisely when Plato, with an almost obsessive level of detail, decides to describe that vanished continent. This is where the myth ceases to be a vague reference and becomes a full chronicle, filled with powerful imagery, exact figures, and urban structures that, even today, continue to evoke awe. The account begins by situating us geographically. According to Plato, Atlantis lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules, that strait which marks the boundary between the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. Beyond that point stretched an island of colossal dimensions, a land capable of hosting an entire civilization, with kingdoms, armies, and a population that, according to the philosopher, had achieved a degree of sophistication far beyond that of any people known to the Greeks. Plato describes a territory blessed by nature. The island had fertile plains stretching in all directions. The surrounding mountains offered abundant minerals, including a mysterious metal that the philosopher calls orichalcum, a material that glowed with a reddish shine and that, according to the account itself, existed only in that part of the world. The natural resources were so vast that the Atlanteans not only met their basic needs but also engaged in monumental architecture, the construction of canals, and the creation of advanced weaponry. One of the most evocative images is that of the capital of Atlantis. According to Plato, the Atlanteans built their main city around a central hill, atop which stood the king's palace. The urban layout followed a concentric design, consisting of rings of land and water forming circular canals connected by bridges. This arrangement served not only as a defensive system, but also allowed for efficient movement of goods and people, a demonstration of the technical skill of its inhabitants. The city's port was of gigantic dimensions. It included docks capable of hosting hundreds of ships, surrounded by warehouses and shipyards. The streets were paved, and the buildings were covered in precious metals, reflecting sunlight in all directions and giving the city an almost supernatural appearance. Temples dedicated to the gods, especially to Poseidon, adorned key points of the metropolis. The statue of the god, according to the account, was monumental, It depicted Poseidon driving 6 winged horses and commanding the skies, the sea, and the earth. Atlantean society was also described as advanced and organized. Its government was in the hands of kings who descended directly from Poseidon and a human woman named Clito. The offspring of this union founded a dynasty of 10 kings who ruled over 10 districts of the island. Law was respected, and the administration was governed by a code that, according to Plato, had been inscribed on a column of orichalcum in the center of the city, right inside the Temple of Poseidon. The wealth of Atlantis was not limited to its architecture or political system. It also had an impressive military development. The Atlantean armies were described as immense, with thousands of war chariots, well-trained infantry, and a naval fleet capable of projecting power across the ocean. The territorial expansion of Atlantis was such that, according to the account, they came to dominate various regions of Europe and northern Africa. But Atlantis, in Plato's narrative, was not only power and splendor. It was also corruption and decadence. As their wealth increased, their morality declined. The Atlanteans began to stray from the virtues that had brought them greatness. Greed, arrogance, and excessive ambition took hold of their leaders. Instead of being content with their vast domains, they decided to undertake the conquest of the entire Mediterranean basin. Athens was the last obstacle in their path. Here is where the story takes on a heroic and almost mythological tone. According to Plato, Athens, despite being a much smaller and less powerful city, managed to stop the Atlantean advance thanks to its courage and commitment to justice. This victory not only represented the triumph of virtue over corruption, but also foreshadowed the final fate of Atlantis. The destruction of the island was as sudden as it was final. Plato expresses it with chilling simplicity. In a single day and a single night of misfortune, Atlantis was swallowed by the sea and disappeared without a trace. The account ends abruptly. The dialogue Critias, in which these events are narrated, is unfinished. We do not know whether Plato planned to develop more details or if he felt that he had already said everything necessary. What is certain is that this lack of closure has been one of the reasons why the mystery of Atlantis has survived to this day. There are those who have focused on the numbers Plato provides, because we are not dealing with a vague description or a simple illusion. The philosopher offers specific measurements. The central plain extended 3,000 stadia in length by 2,000 in width. The city's walls were covered in shining metals, and the network of canals reached lengths that, even today, would astonish any engineer. These data have been interpreted in very different ways over the centuries. Some researchers consider them exaggerations, the product of Plato's rhetoric. Others believe they may hide real figures, coded according to the measurement system of the time. Some even argue that the account is a blend of historical memory and literary license, a mosaic of recollections of past catastrophes. As one progresses through the dialogues, it becomes inevitable to wonder whether Plato was writing based on ancient oral sources or whether it was all a product of his imagination. The philosopher insists, time and again, that what he recounts is true. He states that Solon had brought the story from Egypt and that he had merely transcribed it. This detail, which might seem minor, has been one of the main arguments of those who defend the real existence of Atlantis. And in the end, what fascinates most about Plato's description is that perfect balance between myth and chronicle, between moral tale and historical document. Atlantis, as Plato presents it, is not a fantasy land populated by magical beings. It is a human civilization with virtues and flaws, with architectural achievements and moral miseries, that rises to the summit only to fall catastrophically. At the end of reading these dialogues, one cannot help but feel that Atlantis, more than a lost land, is a universal symbol. It represents the fragility of great civilizations in the face of their own mistakes. A mirror that Plato placed before his own society, but which over the centuries we have ended up placing before our own. Now that we know in detail the vision that Plato left us of Atlantis, it is time to ask what happened after him. Because, surprisingly, for centuries, almost no one would speak of Atlantis again. The story would remain buried, both literally and figuratively, beneath the dust of time. And it is precisely there where the next chapter will take us, to explore the long and mysterious silence that covered Atlantis throughout all of antiquity. The forgetting in Antiquity. It is almost ironic that a story with the power to endure across centuries began, for much of its existence, in absolute silence. After Plato's passionate descriptions, one might imagine that Atlantis would become part of the regular repertoire of ancient writers, that philosophers, historians, and poets would rush to debate, interpret, or expand upon a narrative so filled with mystery and moral warning. However, quite the opposite occurred. What followed was a disconcerting void, an echo that faded before it could consolidate as a popular myth. Atlantis was buried, not by the waters, but by the indifference of its own contemporaries. The first striking fact when exploring this period is the absolute lack of interest shown by later philosophers regarding the story. Aristotle, Plato's direct disciple and one of the brightest minds of his time, not only avoided delving into the subject, but even made a remark full of skepticism. According to some surviving fragments, Aristotle is said to have declared that Plato invented Atlantis and also made it disappear. Considering the close relationship between teacher and student, it is difficult to believe Aristotle was unaware of the story, but all indications suggest he considered it an allegorical invention, a fable with no historical or geographical value. Beyond Aristotle, the outlook does not improve. Throughout the Hellenistic era and the rise of the Roman Empire, when literary, philosophical, and scientific production flourished at levels never before seen, Atlantis remained in the background, almost invisible. Writers such as Strabo, Pliny the Elder, Diodorus of Sicily, or even Herodotus, whose works are full of geographical descriptions and tales of distant lands, maintained absolute silence about the sunken island. None of them seemed to show the slightest interest in revisiting it, analyzing it, or even mentioning it in passing. This disinterest has given rise to multiple interpretations. Some argue that the ancients fully understood that Atlantis was simply a literary device. Plato, in his context, was not writing history, but philosophy. And in the classical world, philosophy had such a conceptual and symbolic nature that it did not require empirical verification. Therefore, no one felt the need to investigate a territory that, from their perspective, did not exist outside the written word. However, there are those who wonder if the forgetting was as spontaneous as it appears. Some scholars who are more critical of the traditional version suggest that Plato's account may have made certain intellectual circles uncomfortable. It is not unreasonable to think that the idea of a powerful, vanished civilization with advanced technological and social features may have clashed with established conceptions of world history. The Greeks had their own narrative of the past, with well-defined heroes, gods, and mythical origins. Atlantis did not fit easily into that framework. Another element that may have contributed to the forgetting is the limited access to Plato's texts. Although today his works are within everyone's reach, in antiquity they belonged to a cultured minority. Platonic dialogues were not widely circulated. They were reserved for philosophical circles, for small academic communities where ethics, metaphysics, and politics were discussed, but where geographical concerns took a backseat. Thus, the story of Atlantis remained confined to a very specific corner of knowledge, almost as a curiosity within Plato's extensive repertoire. Furthermore, the very format in which the philosopher presents the story may have contributed to its obscurity. The dialogues Timaeus and Critias are written in a dense style, filled with cosmological digressions and philosophical reflections that, for the average reader of the time, were difficult to follow. The part dedicated to Atlantis occupies a small portion within broader and more abstract works. In a time when orality was still the dominant medium of cultural transmission, more direct and easily told stories had far greater dissemination than a chronicle embedded within complex dialectical exercises. Another important factor is the Greek attitude itself toward geography and the knowledge of the world. Although the Hellenes explored and traded throughout much of the Mediterranean, their worldview was limited. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the land was a mystery, a territory of the unknown, spoken of with respect but also with incredulity. Any reference to distant lands was tinged with suspicion, as if it were a matter of simple exaggerations or baseless legends. The Roman world, more pragmatic and focused on the administration of its territories, also showed no interest in Atlantis. Its literature focused on other themes: military exploits, politics, daily life, and in the case of more fantastical writers, mythologies that were already part of the collective imagination. Atlantis was not on that list. Neither Virgil, nor Ovid, nor Seneca, nor any of the other great Latin authors felt the need to rescue that submerged tale. As the centuries passed, even the name of Atlantis began to fade. The lack of references, the absence of maps or documents that could corroborate the existence of that island, caused the myth to gradually retreat into the shadows. It was as if Atlantis had sunk twice, once in Plato's narrative, and again in the cultural memory of humanity. Even when some later authors, such as Proclus in the 5th century after Christ, decided to briefly reference the story of Atlantis, they did so more as a philosophical allusion than as a geographical fact worthy of deep investigation. Proclus, for example, believed the account held esoteric meaning, but he did not suggest that the island had existed in the physical sense. And so, while the ancient world advanced, expanded, and changed, Atlantis remained hidden beneath layers of intellectual dust. The rise of Christianity did not help revive the myth either. The new worldview, centered on biblical creation, the Great Flood, and the lineage of Adam and Eve, left little room for vanished prehistoric civilizations that did not fit within the sacred narrative. However, as with every myth with deep roots, Atlantis did not disappear completely. Its name remained preserved in Plato's texts, waiting for the right moment to once again awaken humanity's interest. The Renaissance, with its passion for rediscovering ancient knowledge, would become the stage where Atlantis would resurface with greater strength than ever before. But before reaching that rebirth, it is worth pausing for a moment and reflecting on this long period of silence. Because forgetting does not always mean definitive disappearance. Sometimes, myths sleep beneath the surface like a dormant volcano, accumulating energy, waiting for the precise moment to erupt once more. And that moment was about to arrive. The rediscovery of classical texts during the Renaissance would mark the beginning of a new era for Atlantis, an era of curiosity, speculation, and above all, of search. The long medieval silence. The Middle Ages were, in many ways, a long night for most of the knowledge inherited from classical antiquity. As the lights of Greek and Roman wisdom slowly dimmed under the weight of invasions, wars, and the collapse of empires, the story of Atlantis sank into a deep slumber. A slumber so dense and prolonged that, for entire centuries, the name of that mythical island ceased to appear in writings, philosophical discussions, or the curiosity of scholars. Atlantis was not only lost beneath the waters, according to Plato's tale, it had also sunk into cultural oblivion. To understand this phenomenon, one must look at the ideological and social context that dominated Europe during those dark centuries. From the fall of the Roman Empire until well into the late Middle Ages, intellectual life was ruled by the Church. Knowledge was confined to monasteries, and access to classical texts was an exclusive privilege reserved for a few monks and scholars who, in most cases, copied manuscripts without questioning or exploring the content beyond its theological or moral value. The intellectual priorities of the era revolved around the interpretation of the Holy Scriptures, the preservation of dogma, and the organization of life according to divine will. Anything that did not fit within the biblical framework was deemed suspicious or, outright, considered heresy. Within that context, Atlantis, with its pagan tale of ancient gods, vanished civilizations, and non-Christian punishments, held no interest. There was no room for stories of lost islands or for geographical speculations that might challenge the official worldview. Plato's texts did survive, yes, but in a partial and scattered manner. Many of his dialogues were preserved in handwritten Greek copies or in Latin translations of varying quality. Moreover, access to them was limited to centers of learning such as Constantinople or certain monastic schools in the West. Even in those places, scholars preferred to focus on aspects more directly related to ethics, logic, or metaphysics. Amid that avalanche of philosophical treatises, Atlantis seemed like an anecdote of no particular relevance. Popular culture of the time did not help keep the memory of the lost continent alive either. The medieval mindset was shaped by its own imaginary world, built from Christian legends, saints' lives, chivalric epics, and chronicles of the Crusades. When distant and unknown lands were mentioned, it was more common to refer to the earthly paradise, hell, or places like the kingdom of Prester John. Atlantis did not appear on that symbolic map. It was not one of the lands to be explored, nor a missionary goal, nor a source of wealth sought by Christian kingdoms. Even the general interest in geography was in a rudimentary state. Medieval maps were more theological representations than navigation tools. The so-called TO maps, for instance, depicted the world as a circle divided into three parts: Asia, Europe, and Africa, with Jerusalem at the center. Beyond those regions lay uncertainty, a realm of monsters and mythical creatures. Within this representational framework, Atlantis had no place. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, where classical knowledge was preserved with greater care and dedication, Arab scholars did show a strong interest in Greek philosophy, but their focus was primarily on authors like Aristotle, Galen, or Euclid. Platonic texts, particularly the dialogues in which Atlantis is narrated, were not among those prioritized for translation or study. Science, medicine, and mathematics held greater relevance. Thus, no effort came from the East to revive the myth either. The long slumber lasted for centuries. Atlantis remained asleep on dusty library shelves, accessible only to a privileged few. If its memory existed at all, it was a faint echo, a nearly forgotten reference within texts that hardly circulated. It was not until the 12th century that the first signs of a timid rediscovery of Plato began to appear in Europe. Thanks to the cultural contact between East and West during the Crusades, and to the translations carried out in centers such as Toledo and Palermo, some classical works began to once again reach the hands of European scholars. However, much time would still pass before Atlantis returned to the center of attention. The priority remained the recovery of more practical scientific and philosophical texts, or those more aligned with the Christian worldview. One must wait until the Renaissance for the interest in classical antiquity to re-emerge with enough strength for a tale like that of Atlantis to once again capture the imagination of philosophers, cartographers, and adventurers. Renaissance humanism, with its gaze turned toward the past glories of Greece and Rome, would open the door to a rediscovery of Plato's account. But until then, throughout the early and much of the High Middle Ages, Atlantis remained a secret buried in libraries, completely detached from the concerns of the medieval mind. This absence of references has left a mark that contemporary historians are still trying to interpret. Some argue that the myth never had true popular roots in antiquity, and that its forgetting was therefore a natural consequence. Others believe that the imposition of a single worldview during the Middle Ages was a key factor in sidelining or outright ignoring stories like that of Atlantis. What is certain is that, by the end of this period, Atlantis had ceased to be a topic of conversation, study, or inquiry. It was simply a curiosity buried among the texts of a philosopher who, during those centuries, was not among the most read or discussed. But every night has its dawn, and the Renaissance, with its obsession for dusting off lost knowledge, was about to give Atlantis a second chance. A chance to once again be dreamed of, debated, and above all, sought after. In the next chapter, we will follow that intellectual awakening. It will be time to see how, after nearly 1,000 years of silence, Atlantis would once again be spoken aloud by those who, in rediscovering Plato, also rediscovered his most mysterious tale. The rediscovery during the Renaissance. After so many centuries of forgetfulness, of silence accumulated between the walls of monasteries and the dusty shelves of forgotten libraries, the moment finally came when Europe began to turn its gaze toward its past with an eagerness never seen before. The Renaissance was much more than a period of artistic advancement or scientific rediscovery. It was a profound awakening, a kind of intellectual fever that pushed entire generations of thinkers, artists, and explorers to unearth what had been buried for centuries. And among the many treasures rescued from oblivion, Atlantis emerged once again. The process of recovering classical texts was neither immediate nor easy. The fall of Constantinople in the year 1453 caused many Greek scholars, fearful of losing their heritage to the advancing Ottomans, to flee westward carrying manuscripts, translations, and knowledge that had long been guarded. Suddenly, in cities such as Florence, Rome, and Venice, copies of works that had barely been consulted for centuries began to circulate. Plato, who until then had been read only sporadically and selectively, regained his place among the great philosophers of antiquity. His dialogues, once confined to narrow theological or academic circles, began to be translated into Latin and other European languages. With this new dissemination, the story of Atlantis began to come alive once more among intellectuals who saw in ancient writings more than just philosophical exercises. It was in this atmosphere of enthusiasm for classical knowledge that the tale of Atlantis began to be read with new eyes. Humanists, obsessed with finding answers in the past to the great questions of their own time, found in the story of that vanished island a fascinating enigma. It was no longer seen as merely a moral fable. For many, it represented a historical possibility, a missing piece in the puzzle of humanity. Figures such as Marsilio Ficino, one of the first to translate Plato's works into Latin, helped return the philosopher's original voice to the Western world. Thanks to his efforts, the dialogues Timaeus and Critias began to circulate among Renaissance thinkers. Philosophers, astronomers, cartographers, and explorers started to discuss the true meaning of that tale. The questions arose inevitably. Was Atlantis merely a myth, or had it truly existed? Could it have been a civilization as advanced as Plato described? Where would that lost land be found today? The geographical context of the Renaissance also played a decisive role in this rediscovery. Europe was experiencing an explosion of maritime exploration. Maps, which until then had portrayed a limited world full of blank spaces, began to expand. New territories were being discovered beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The existence of unknown lands no longer seemed like fantasy. It had become tangible reality. America had just been revealed to European eyes, and that discovery was, without doubt, a catalyst for many to begin drawing connections between the New World and Plato's ancient tale. Christopher Columbus, although he did not mention Atlantis explicitly in his journals, was convinced that he was sailing toward lands described by the ancients. And not long after, several chroniclers and explorers began to suggest that perhaps America was, in fact, the lost continent Plato had spoken of. Advancements in cartography accompanied this wave of enthusiasm. Maps produced by figures such as Piri Reis or Martin Waldseemüller began to depict new coasts, archipelagos, and continents, fueling the imagination of those searching geography for answers to philosophical mysteries. The relationship between exploration and myth grew inevitably stronger. In this environment of discovery and the revival of ancient knowledge, the first works also appeared that dared to openly speculate about Atlantis as a real and tangible civilization. Philosophers, poets, and even some members of the clergy began to interpret Plato's words literally. The line that separated myth from history began to blur. But the Renaissance was not only a time of rediscovering ancient knowledge. It was also a period when Europe's great powers needed to justify their expansion. Finding ancient references that spoke of lands beyond the Atlantic served, in a way, as intellectual support for colonial enterprises. The idea of a lost continent provided the perfect excuse for many to continue exploring, conquering, and claiming new territories. At the same time, interest in hermetic and esoteric knowledge also began to grow. Plato's works were viewed by some not merely as philosophical texts, but as vessels of hidden truths. Allegorical, mystical, and even astronomical interpretations of Atlantis began to emerge. There were those who claimed the story contained secret keys about the formation of the universe, the structure of the earth, or the spiritual evolution of humanity. Of course, this renewed interest was not without contradictions. While some scholars continued to view Atlantis as a political metaphor, others saw it as a lost geographical reference, something that could be found if one read Plato carefully and searched in the right place. The lack of consensus only served to further fuel the flame of mystery. As the Renaissance progressed, new schools of thought began to combine Plato's narrative with the scientific discoveries of the time. The idea that massive natural cataclysms could have wiped an entire civilization off the map began to take shape. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis. These were all considered possible explanations for the sudden disappearance described by Plato. The result of this entire process was that, by the end of the 16th century, Atlantis was no longer just a buried reference in a philosopher's dialogue. It had become a topic of debate, a subject of speculative maps, and a protagonist in conversations among sailors, scholars, and adventurers. This awakening, which began as an exercise in recovering ancient texts, would ultimately lay the foundation for the explosion of theories that would emerge in the centuries to follow. Atlantis would no longer fall into oblivion. From this point on, its presence in the collective imagination would only grow stronger. And so, as printing presses continued to produce new copies of Plato's dialogues and world maps kept pushing their boundaries, a new chapter in the story of Atlantis began to be written, a chapter in which explorers and navigators would now take part in the search. The dream of the explorers. The wind of the Renaissance had blown strong, shaking the foundations of knowledge and awakening a curiosity that Europe had not known for centuries. The old certainties began to falter. The discovery of America had shattered the traditional perception of the world. The Earth no longer ended at the known horizon, and beyond the Pillars of Hercules, there were, in fact, new lands, vast and, in many cases, unexplored. It was in that context that the myth of Atlantis transformed into much more than an ancient story. It became a real possibility, a land that perhaps, with enough effort and determination, could be found. The navigators of the 15th and 16th centuries did not carry only compasses and sextants aboard their vessels. They also carried in their minds a catalog of legends, rumors, and promises of unimaginable riches. And among all those legends, the echo of Atlantis began to sound louder and louder. Christopher Columbus, in his pursuit of a westward route to the Indies, consulted ancient maps and texts that described lands across the Atlantic. Although he did not make a direct and explicit reference to Atlantis in his writings, he did repeatedly mention the existence of islands and territories described by classical authors. Some historians believe that Columbus, deep in his thoughts, did not rule out the possibility that those unknown lands were somehow connected to Plato's descriptions. The very discovery of America in 1492 immediately rekindled interest in Plato's tale. The arrival of news about exotic civilizations, grand cities, and advanced cultures that Europeans had never imagined caused many intellectuals of the time to begin asking a question that had previously seemed absurd. What if Atlantis was not a myth? What if those newly discovered territories were, in fact, the remnants of the lost civilization Plato had described more than 1,000 years earlier? Connections began to form almost automatically. The existence of massive structures in America, such as the Aztec pyramids or the Mayan temples, led some scholars to see parallels between these cultures and the Atlanteans. Although the historical, architectural, and cultural differences were vast, the desire to find a tangible answer to Plato's narrative was so strong that any clue, no matter how small, was taken as a sign. Meanwhile, in Europe, cartographers began to include on their maps details that mixed real information with conjecture and legend. On some of these maps, mysterious islands appeared in the middle of the Atlantic, in positions that seemed to align, at least partially, with the supposed location of Atlantis. A famous example is the map of Piri Reis, created in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral, which includes a depiction of Atlantic coasts filled with puzzling details for that time. The adventurous spirit of the 16th century found in Atlantis one more reason to keep pushing into the unknown. The story offered a tempting reward: the discovery of a lost civilization, perhaps filled with riches, hidden technological or philosophical secrets, waiting to be found beneath layers of earth, water, or vegetation. One of the most striking cases was that of Pedro Sarmiento de Gamboa, a Spanish explorer and scholar of the 16th century who wrote extensively about the possibility that Atlantis had been a real civilization. Sarmiento de Gamboa devoted part of his research to linking Plato's narrative with the geographic discoveries of his time, convinced that tangible evidence of the island's existence could someday be found. This feverish search also attracted the chroniclers of the Indies. Authors such as Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo or Bartolomé de las Casas, in their descriptions of the newly discovered lands and the civilizations inhabiting the Americas, occasionally mentioned theories that connected those territories with ancient Greco-Latin tales. Atlantis appeared as one more possibility within the broad spectrum of explanations used to justify the existence of such advanced cultures on the far side of the ocean. The interest was not limited only to the Americas. There were also explorers and thinkers who placed Atlantis in locations closer to Europe, such as the Canary Islands, Madeira, or the Azores. The geographical position of these islands, just west of the Pillars of Hercules, seemed to match Plato's indications. The natural wealth of those territories and the presence of archaeological remains of uncertain origin fed the hypothesis that perhaps those archipelagos were the last surviving fragments of what had once been Atlantis. In that relentless search, expeditions multiplied. Each new archaeological finding, each discovery of ruins, each tale brought back by sailors from distant lands served as fuel to keep alive the dream of finding the lost continent. Even in port cities such as Lisbon, Seville, or Venice, where sailor stories circulated like currency, it was common to hear accounts of mysterious islands that appeared and disappeared, of lands seen on the horizon and then vanishing like a mirage. Literature also began to play its part in this setting. Some Renaissance writers began to include references to Atlantis in their works, presenting it as a symbol of the possibilities that awaited beyond the known horizon. This blend of reality and fiction, of exploration and legend, made Atlantis a constant presence in the collective imagination of the era. The obsession reached such a point that some explorers began to include in their journals references to the search for lands that, they claimed, matched Plato's descriptions. Although many of these expeditions ended in failure or were lost in the immensity of the ocean, each attempt reinforced the idea that Atlantis was still out there, waiting to be found. By the end of the 16th century, Atlantis had ceased to be merely an ancient tale. It had become a real objective for some of the boldest navigators of the time. The combination of conquest, the thirst for discovery, and the magnetic pull of the myth had placed it once again on the mental map of the Western world. But what was about to come would be even more fascinating. For while explorers were charting routes across the ocean, a new approach was beginning to take shape in universities and academies. Science, taking its first steps toward modernity, would begin to look at Atlantis with different eyes, trying to separate myth from reality using more rigorous methods. That will be the next chapter in this journey through the history of Atlantis. The moment when the curiosity of the navigators gave way to the systematic investigation of the first scientists of the 19th century. The scientific fever of the 19th century. As the 18th century came to an end and the 19th century began to unfold its wings, Europe entered a new era defined by the worship of knowledge, experimentation, and scientific exploration. The Industrial Revolution had changed the way humanity understood its surroundings. Technology was advancing by leaps and bounds, and the need to understand the past using tools beyond mere philosophical speculation began to take root. It was within this context of rationalism and method that Atlantis re-emerged, this time in the hands of scientists, archaeologists, and researchers convinced that, behind the legend, a tangible truth might be hiding. For centuries, Plato's account had remained a recurring topic in esoteric circles or served as literary material for writers with a taste for fantasy. However, in the 19th century, everything changed. Archaeology was beginning to establish itself as a serious and respected discipline, leaving behind its amateur origins. Excavations in places such as Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Mediterranean region began to reveal that many of the stories previously considered mythological by earlier generations could have a historical basis. Homer's Troy, for example, went from being a mere epic tale to becoming a physical city, with architectural remains that proved its historical existence. That discovery of Troy, led by Heinrich Schliemann in the 1870s, inspired a growing number of researchers and enthusiasts to wonder whether Atlantis could follow the same path. If Troy, long considered a fantasy, had been unearthed with picks and shovels, then why could the same not happen with Atlantis? In this atmosphere of scientific optimism, a key figure emerged who would forever shape the way the modern world understands Atlantis: Ignatius Donnelly. A politician, writer, and self-taught enthusiast, Donnelly published his most influential work in 1882, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. This book, which soon became a publishing sensation, was the first to propose a comprehensive, well-documented, and extensively argued theory in defense of the real existence of Atlantis. Donnelly was not an archaeologist, but his ability to collect, analyze, and connect data from various disciplines allowed him to construct a compelling and highly persuasive narrative for his time. His central thesis held that Atlantis had not only existed, but had been the cradle of all great civilizations. According to his interpretation, after the island's disappearance, its survivors had migrated to different parts of the world, carrying with them their knowledge, architecture, art, and social structure. Donnelly's book blended quotations from Plato, geological studies, references to the cultures of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Americas, and even linguistic comparisons which, according to him, demonstrated deep connections between seemingly unrelated peoples. He proposed that the similarities between the pyramids of Egypt and those of Mesoamerica, for example, were the direct result of a common Atlantean origin. The theory of an antediluvian world gained momentum, and for the first time, Atlantis ceased to be a mere intellectual curiosity and became a true collective obsession. The book's impact was immediate and widespread. It captured not only the attention of academic circles, but also became popular reading. The press, eager for striking headlines, began publishing articles and reports about the real possibility that a lost and advanced civilization might lie beneath the Atlantic Ocean. Lectures on the subject filled auditoriums. The idea of Atlantis as the cradle of humanity became fully embedded in popular culture. This renewed interest also coincided with a time of great technological advances in the fields of geography and marine exploration. The first scientific expeditions to the ocean floor began providing data on submarine topography. The discovery of oceanic ridges, elevations, and depressions on the Atlantic seabed further fueled the theory that Atlantis might have once stood there before sinking. One of the most striking discoveries was that of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, a vast underwater mountain range stretching from north to south across the Atlantic. Some researchers, lacking definitive evidence but brimming with enthusiasm, began to suggest that this geological formation might have been, thousands of years ago, a landmass that housed the mythical island described by Plato. The Atlantean fever of the 19th century was not limited to serious researchers. Opportunists and visionaries without scientific grounding also emerged in large numbers. Dozens of books were published, mixing history, pseudoscience, and spiritualism. Public lectures were held where the exact location of Atlantis was promised to be revealed. Some even claimed to possess secret maps or to have found submerged architectural remains. Yet, beyond the excesses, what became clear was that Atlantis had fully entered the intellectual agenda of the time. The line between science and myth, between rigorous investigation and speculative fantasy, became more blurred than ever. For the first time, archaeologists and geologists, writers and journalists, academics and autodidacts, all seemed to be part of the same global pursuit. A search whose ultimate goal was to answer the great, long unresolved question: did Atlantis truly exist? The influence of Donnelly and his followers ran so deep that, in the decades that followed, nearly every significant archaeological discovery anywhere in the world was analyzed through an Atlantean lens. From megalithic remains on Europe's coasts to submerged ruins in the Caribbean, everything was viewed as a potential clue leading to the Great Revelation. Science, of course, continued to advance in its methods and, gradually, began to demand more solid, verifiable evidence. But that is another story, one that belongs to the next phase of this journey. The era in which Atlantis would become increasingly intertwined with philosophical, spiritual, and esoteric movements that would give rise to new theories, many of them even more astonishing and bewildering. And so, as the 19th century drew to a close, Atlantis was no longer just an ancient myth or a drawing room hypothesis. It had become an intellectual fever that, at times, seemed on the verge of becoming an archaeological discovery. A fever that, far from fading, would find a new surge of energy in the 20th century, in the hands of mystics, esoteric thinkers, and seekers of hidden truths. The seduction of esotericism. As the 19th century came to an end and the new century loomed on the horizon, Atlantis underwent a profound transformation in how it was understood and represented. Whereas in previous decades it had been the subject of scientific speculation, hypothetical maps, and archaeological debates, from this moment onward it began to enter a far more slippery, mysterious, and, for many, unsettling realm: the world of esotericism. It was as if Atlantis had ceased to be merely a lost continent and had become a symbol of hidden knowledge, ancient wisdom, and forbidden truths. This shift was no coincidence. The early 20th century was marked by a spiritual fervor that swept across Europe and the Americas. The unstoppable advance of science, with its rational explanations for nearly everything, triggered a counter-reaction in certain sectors of society. Many sought answers beyond the empirical method, in subtler dimensions, in invisible realms that eluded traditional logic. Atlantis, with its perfect mix of mystery, antiquity, and tragedy, became fertile ground for these new interpretations. One of the most influential figures during this period was Helena Blavatsky, founder of the Theosophical Society. Her monumental work, published under the title The Secret Doctrine in 1888, completely revolutionized the perception of Atlantis. For Blavatsky, the island was not merely an advanced civilization in terms of technology or politics. Atlantis represented, above all, an evolutionary stage of humanity. According to her, earthly civilizations developed in cycles, known as root races, and Atlantis corresponded to one of those great epochs, preceding our current era. Blavatsky described the Atlanteans as beings endowed with extraordinary psychic powers, possessing technology that defied the known laws of physics, and a spiritual mastery far beyond that of later cultures. According to her account, the Atlanteans were experts in the use of invisible energies, capable of moving objects with the power of the mind, communicating over long distances, and manipulating matter in ways we would now consider impossible. The fall of Atlantis, in this context, was not merely a geological disaster, but the result of moral and spiritual decay that led to its complete destruction. Blavatsky's work was widely circulated and soon inspired an entire generation of esoteric thinkers. Among them stood out Rudolf Steiner, who developed his own vision of Atlantis within the framework of anthroposophy. For Steiner, Atlantis had not only existed, but had been the birthplace of human faculties that, over time, had atrophied. According to his teachings, during the Atlantean era, human beings had direct perception of the spiritual world, a kind of natural clairvoyance that vanished after the fall of that continent. Another key figure in this wave of reinterpretations was Edgar Cayce, known as the Sleeping Prophet. Through his famous trances, Cayce gave hundreds of readings in which he described in astonishing detail the location, customs, and technology of Atlantis. According to his visions, part of the island lay near the Bahamas, especially in the area of Bimini. Cayce claimed that beneath those waters rested remnants of temples and energy devices that, sooner or later, would be discovered by humanity. Cayce's predictions had an enormous impact, particularly within the esoteric circles of the United States. For decades, numerous researchers and amateur divers set out to explore the Bimini area in search of evidence to confirm his visions. The famous Bimini Road, an underwater rock formation that some interpreted as an artificial path, was seen as definitive proof that Cayce had been right. Although the scientific community insisted that it was a natural geological phenomenon, the enthusiasm to find Atlantean remains in the Caribbean never fully faded. This stage in the history of Atlantis also coincided with the rise of philosophical and spiritual movements that blended elements from various traditions: European occultism, American spiritualism, and Eastern religions. Atlantis became part of the common vocabulary of esoteric schools, referenced as an example of a glorious and fallen past, as a warning of what could happen to humanity if it continued down a path of arrogance and spiritual disconnection. Curiously, the esoteric narrative of Atlantis was not confined to the English-speaking world. In countries such as Germany and France, the idea of an ancient advanced civilization was adopted and reinterpreted by groups with very different agendas. While some viewed it as the origin of lost spiritual knowledge, others began linking it to racial theories that would later take a dangerous turn, particularly in the decades leading up to the Second World War. The fascination with Atlantis in the esoteric world reached its peak in the early decades of the 20th century. Books were written, conferences held, secret societies founded, and countless articles published in specialized journals. For many people, Atlantis was no longer a geographic mystery, but a spiritual symbol. A reminder that humanity, at some point in its history, had been much closer to the stars and to universal knowledge than would ever be officially admitted. Of course, this entire perspective also drew criticism. The most rigorous historians and archaeologists dismissed these theories as nothing more than fantasies without any foundation. But that did not stop the myth from advancing. On the contrary, the fact that traditional science refused to accept these ideas served as fuel to reinforce the narrative that knowledge about Atlantis was being deliberately suppressed. From that point forward, Atlantis became inextricably linked to the concept of hidden knowledge. Any topic related to vanished civilizations, forbidden wisdom, or alternative archaeology seemed to have, in one way or another, a connection to the submerged island. Atlantis had changed its form. It had left behind its image as a mere lost continent to become an archetype of mystery, of lost wisdom, and of the eternal search. But while the esoteric world continued building increasingly elaborate theories, the 20th century would bring with it a new type of quest, the archaeological and scientific one, armed with technology and modern methodology, attempting to unearth, this time quite literally, the remains of Atlantis. And that will be our next step, to delve into the first excavations and archaeological discoveries that, unintentionally, would reignite the hope of finding the lost city that Plato described centuries ago. The first archaeological discoveries. The 20th century began with a humanity eager to uncover its most remote past, and archaeology was undergoing a profound transformation. It was no longer seen as merely a hobby for adventurers or collectors of antiquities. It was becoming a rigorous discipline, supported by increasingly sophisticated scientific methods. And it was precisely in this atmosphere of enthusiasm for ancient discoveries that the search for Atlantis found a new path of exploration. Digging into the earth, searching for tangible remains, for stones, walls, and artifacts that could finally confirm the existence of that lost civilization. Until then, everything related to Atlantis had been the domain of philosophers, mystics, writers, and speculators. But now, the interest began to shift to the field, to excavation sites and laboratories where layers of soil and geological samples were being analyzed. The possibility of finding a buried or sunken city began to carry an appeal that went far beyond mere intellectual curiosity. It was a matter of demonstrating through physical evidence that Plato's story could be rooted in reality. One of the catalysts for this new phase was, without a doubt, the discovery of Troy by Heinrich Schliemann at the end of the 19th century. The revelation that a city considered for centuries to be mere Homeric fiction had actually been buried beneath layers of sediment in present-day Turkey shook the foundations of academic thought. If Troy had been real, why not Atlantis? This question began to take hold in the minds of archaeologists and scholars who had, until then, dismissed Plato's account as nothing more than allegory. Another discovery that contributed to this shift in perspective was the unearthing of the Minoan civilization on the island of Crete, and later, the ruins of Akrotiri on the island of Santorini. The excavations at Knossos, led by British archaeologist Arthur Evans in the early 20th century, revealed a civilization surprisingly advanced for its time. Refined art, complex writing systems, and architecture that displayed astonishing technical skill. The Minoan civilization, previously almost unknown, began to be seen by some as a possible historical model for Plato's Atlantis. The connection between the volcanic eruption that destroyed much of Santorini and the story of Atlantis's submersion began to take shape in the minds of various researchers. The idea that a natural cataclysm could have wiped out an entire civilization offered a plausible explanation for what, for centuries, had seemed to be only a myth. Furthermore, Plato's description of a seafaring, advanced, and wealthy people aligned in some ways with what the Aegean excavations were bringing to light. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, archaeologists and amateur historians began discovering the remains of cities and structures that were immediately linked to Atlantis. In Central America, for example, the Mayan pyramids and the ruins of Tiahuanaco in Bolivia were cited by some as evidence of a civilization that might have had direct ties to the lost island. Though these associations lacked solid scientific foundation, the popular enthusiasm for finding Atlantis led to every spectacular discovery being reinterpreted through that lens. In parallel, underwater discoveries reignited public interest. In the 1960s, a scientific expedition exploring the seafloor near the Bahamas identified what appeared to be a rock formation aligned in an artificial pattern. That find, known ever since as the Bimini Road, was immediately associated by followers of Edgar Cayce with the predictions of the sleeping prophet. Although geologists asserted that the formation was of natural origin, the media excitement had already done its work. Images of stone blocks underwater circulated through newspapers and magazines, fueling hopes that a piece of Atlantis had finally been found. The first underwater surveys, made possible by advancements in diving and sonar technology, began to focus on areas suggested by Plato. The Atlantic, especially around the Azores and the Canary Islands. Searches were also conducted in the Mediterranean and parts of North Africa. However, every time a promising discovery was made, skeptical voices emerged to dismantle the hypotheses with scientific arguments. The absence of human remains, inscriptions, or unequivocal cultural objects led the academic community to insist on the need for more conclusive evidence. The press of the time, always eager to exploit mystery, exaggerated every discovery that could be linked, even remotely, to Atlantis. Some reports claimed that submerged columns, vanished roads, or even underwater walls had been found. Most of these claims, however, could not withstand even the most basic scrutiny. Nevertheless, the combination of real archaeological discoveries, such as Troy or the Minoan civilization, with underwater explorations, and the growing fascination with ancient enigmas, kept the flame of the search alive. Atlantis, which for centuries had existed only as a story written in Plato's dialogues, was beginning to take on a more tangible form. Though it had not been found, it was more present than ever. Archaeology continued to advance, and with every discovery of a civilization once thought lost, the myth of Atlantis seemed to gain a bit more legitimacy in the eyes of the public. The idea that entire cities might be buried beneath our feet or beneath the waters around us was no longer a mere fantasy. But what is most curious is that, while archaeologists were digging into the ground and exploring the oceans for clues, a new generation of theorists began to suggest that perhaps Plato had not been referring to the Atlantic Ocean at all. Maybe the lost island was not beyond the Pillars of Hercules, but much closer, right in the heart of the Mediterranean. That twist in the story, the shift from searching in the Atlantic to looking toward the Aegean, would be the next chapter in this fascinating quest. The theory that pointed to Santorini and the Minoan civilization as the possible real-world inspiration behind the myth of Atlantis. The Atlantic theory. As the 20th century progressed and underwater exploration technologies opened new windows into the unknown, the imagination of researchers and enthusiasts once again focused on the geographic area that, from the beginning, seemed to make the most sense according to Plato's original account: the Atlantic Ocean. The simple mention of the Pillars of Hercules in classical texts served as a conceptual compass for those who believed that Atlantis could not be anywhere else. Beyond that mythical strait, where the Mediterranean gives way to the vast and mysterious ocean, many located the setting of the tragedy that would have buried the lost island forever. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge quickly became the subject of study. It is an immense underwater mountain range that stretches from north to south through the Atlantic, extending from the Arctic coasts to the South Atlantic. When the first detailed maps of the ocean floor began to be created thanks to oceanographic research, several scholars interpreted that this geological formation could, in a remote time, have been a landmass above sea level. The idea that a large island, or even a small continent, might have once existed in the heart of the Atlantic now seemed more plausible than ever. The Azores, that Portuguese archipelago made up of 9 islands, gained particular prominence within these theories. Their location just west of the Iberian Peninsula and within the area marked by the Pillars of Hercules made them a natural candidate. Furthermore, the Azores possess geological features of volcanic origin, which fit perfectly with Plato's description of a land destroyed by natural disasters. Numerous researchers began traveling there, convinced that beneath the waters surrounding the islands might lie the remains of temples, ports, and canals like those described by Plato in his dialogues. During the 1940s and 1950s, several scientific expeditions focused on exploring the seabeds of this region. Side-scan sonar was employed, and dredging was conducted on the ocean floor in search of artificial formations or archaeological remains. The results, however, were ambiguous. Some rock formations appeared to show alignments that, at first glance, could seem man-made, but later analyses indicated they were natural phenomena caused by the volcanic and tectonic activity characteristic of the area. Despite the lack of conclusive evidence, enthusiasm did not wane. Every new report mentioning irregularities on the seabed was received as a possible clue. Some specialized magazines published articles discussing supposed rectilinear structures underwater, and there were even those who claimed to have found stone blocks which, according to them, could only have been carved by human hands. The Canary Islands also entered the radar of Atlantis seekers. Their geographical position, like that of the Azores, seemed to align with Plato's account. Additionally, the Guanche culture, the ancient inhabitants of the islands, was interpreted by some authors as the last remnant of a much older civilization. The megalithic constructions that can still be visited in some parts of the islands were seen as potential traces of an Atlantean past. However, modern archaeological studies have demonstrated that these structures are much more recent and that the Guanches were a Neolithic society with no proven connection to ancient Mediterranean or Atlantic civilizations. Another point of interest was the so-called Azores Plateau, a raised area of the ocean floor located in the North Atlantic. Some geologists speculated that during the ice ages, when sea levels were considerably lower, parts of this plateau might have been above water. This hypothesis, though attractive, was never supported by solid archaeological evidence. In parallel with field research, several authors began to publish books enthusiastically supporting the Atlantic theory. One of the most influential was Charles Berlitz, whose 1969 book The Mystery of Atlantis once again popularized the idea that the remains of Atlantis lay within the Atlantic. Berlitz, already known for his work on the Bermuda Triangle, combined historical data, sailors' tales, and alleged archaeological findings to craft a narrative that captivated the general public. His theories, although criticized by the academic community, had enormous media impact and brought Atlantis back to the forefront of global discussion. The Atlantic hypothesis did not end there. Even within the scientific community, some researchers began analyzing geological samples from the ocean depths to search for signs of recent submersions in geological terms. However, the results showed that, although the Atlantic has undergone significant tectonic and volcanic processes, there is no clear evidence that a large landmass sank there within a time frame compatible with Plato's account. Nevertheless, the appeal of this theory remained intact. The idea that Atlantis lay hidden beneath the waters of the Atlantic had a symbolic and emotional power that surpassed any scientific objection. The ocean's immensity, the difficulty of exploring its depths in detail, and the mystique surrounding all things related to lost lands contributed to the general public continuing to view the Atlantic as the perfect hiding place for the vanished island. During the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st, oceanographic expeditions have greatly expanded the available information on the topography of the Atlantic. Detailed maps of the ocean floor, created thanks to satellites and high-precision probes, have allowed researchers to rule out the existence of any large submerged land masses. But even so, there are those who maintain that even if Atlantis was not a continent, it could have been a moderately sized island, large enough to host an advanced civilization and small enough to disappear entirely due to a catastrophic event. The Atlantic theory remains alive, fueled by new discoveries, reinterpretations of geological data, and above all, the enduring fascination with the idea of a civilization buried beneath the sea. The Atlantic, with its mysterious currents, its silent zones, and its vast, unfathomable expanse, continues to be the preferred setting for those who still dream of finding the ruins of Atlantis. But while some keep looking westward, others began to turn their attention to the Mediterranean, convinced that perhaps the mistake had been in interpreting Plato's words too literally. And that new approach, which would place Atlantis much closer to Greece, leads us to the next chapter of this story. The Shadow of Santorini. For centuries, the search for Atlantis had looked westward, toward the vast and enigmatic Atlantic Ocean, where the collective imagination had placed the vanished island. But in the second half of the 20th century, an unexpected shift changed the focus of researchers, archaeologists, and geologists. Attention began to turn toward a place much closer, a corner of the Mediterranean whose tragic history seemed to align too perfectly with the description Plato left in his dialogues. The island of Santorini. Located in the Aegean Sea, north of Crete, Santorini is today a popular tourist destination, with its whitewashed houses clinging to volcanic cliffs and its spectacular views of the sea. But behind that idyllic postcard lies one of the greatest natural disasters in human history. Approximately 3,600 years ago, a colossal volcanic eruption devastated the island, which at the time was known as Thera. The explosion was so violent that it destroyed a large portion of the land, causing a collapse that formed the submerged caldera that now defines Santorini's landscape. The impact of that cataclysm was not limited to the island itself. The ash cloud covered much of the eastern Mediterranean sky, triggering climatic and agricultural changes that affected various regions. What had once been a prosperous island with an advanced cultural and architectural level disappeared in a matter of hours, buried under meters of pumice stone and volcanic ash. The similarity with Plato's description of Atlantis did not go unnoticed by researchers. It was during the 1950s and 1960s that several archaeologists began to directly link the catastrophe of Santorini with the Atlantean narrative. One of the discoveries that marked a turning point was the uncovering of Akrotiri, a Minoan city buried under layers of volcanic material, resembling what would later happen in Pompeii centuries afterward. The excavations, led by Spiridon Marinatos, revealed perfectly laid out streets, multi-story houses, frescoes of astonishing artistic quality, and an advanced sewage system for the time. The exceptional preservation of Akrotiri offered a direct window into the Minoan world, and it was precisely the level of development of this civilization that led many specialists to draw parallels with Atlantis. The Minoans had mastered maritime trade in the Mediterranean, controlling routes and establishing commercial relationships with Egypt and the Levant. Their architecture demonstrated admirable technical knowledge, and their artistic expressions reflected a prosperous and sophisticated society. The theory that Santorini could be Atlantis began to gain followers due to a series of coincidences that were difficult to ignore: the location in the Mediterranean, the existence of an advanced seafaring civilization, the sudden collapse due to a natural disaster, and, above all, tangible archaeological evidence. Everything seemed to fit within the puzzle. Even the dating of the event appeared to align, at least approximately, with the time references given by Plato, if interpreted with some flexibility. According to certain researchers, the thousands of years Plato mentions may have been the result of transcription errors, misinterpretations, or simple rhetorical exaggerations. If the numbers were adjusted to more realistic timeframes, the eruption of Thera could be situated within a historical context that Plato, or those who passed the story to him, might have known indirectly. But the Santorini theory also had its detractors. Purists of Plato's text pointed out that, according to the original account, Atlantis was supposed to lie beyond the Pillars of Hercules, that is, outside the Mediterranean. Additionally, the size of the island described by Plato seemed far greater than that of Santorini, even before the eruption. The extent of Atlantis's central plain and the scale of its military power did not fully match what was known about the Minoan civilization. Despite these discrepancies, the Santorini theory remained strong within academic circles for one fundamental reason. For the first time, there was real archaeological evidence that could be studied, measured, and dated. Excavations continued for decades, unearthing new frescoes, tools, architectural remains, and traces of a society that, for many, represented the missing link between myth and history. Geological studies also supported the theory from another angle. The magnitude of the Thera eruption was such that it generated a tsunami that affected the coasts of Crete and other regions of the Mediterranean. Some experts believe that this tsunami may have caused the destruction of Minoan cities on the island of Crete, weakening the civilization to the point of facilitating its eventual collapse in the face of the Mycenaean invasion. The combination of these geological, archaeological, and cultural factors turned Santorini into a sort of official candidate among scientific explanations for Atlantis. Although many doubts remained, the theory was solid compared to other, more speculative proposals. At last, science had a credible setting in which to place the myth. Over the years, Santorini became a destination for archaeologists, historians, and curious visitors drawn by the possibility of walking upon the remains of Atlantis. The excavated streets of Akrotiri, its frescoes and silent plazas, covered for centuries in ash, offered an experience that seemed to transport visitors to a time suspended in history. It was as if, in the dense air of the underground galleries, the echo of a lost civilization still floated. However, the Santorini theory did not definitively solve the mystery. The debate over the real location of Atlantis remained open. There were those who, convinced the island lay in the Atlantic, rejected any identification with Santorini. Others proposed even bolder theories, placing it as far afield as the Americas or the Arctic. But what is certain is that, from this point onward, science and archaeology would enter a new phase. A phase in which the search for Atlantis would multiply in unexpected directions. The Mediterranean had offered valuable clues, but there was still much left to explore, to theorize, and to debate. Atlantis remained elusive, drifting between history, geology, and myth. And precisely for that reason, in the next chapter, we will delve into one of the most controversial and intriguing theories: the possibility that Atlantis might have been, against all geographic logic, in the Americas. America and Atlantis. While archaeological research in the Mediterranean continued and the Santorini hypothesis gained support among academic circles, another line of thought began to gain traction, particularly on the other side of the Atlantic. A theory that at the time was as provocative as it was fascinating. The possibility that Atlantis, far from being located near Europe, was actually the American continent, or at least part of it. This idea, initially regarded as a marginal speculation, gradually gained ground as researchers began comparing pre-Columbian cultures to Plato's descriptions. The discovery of America had opened a floodgate of mysteries that Europe was still struggling to comprehend. The existence of civilizations as advanced as the Aztecs, the Maya, or the Inca, with their impressive architectural, astronomical, and administrative achievements, posed an uncomfortable question for many thinkers of the 16th and 17th centuries. How was it possible that a continent unknown to Europeans harbored cultures with such a high level of development, despite having had no previous contact with the Old World? It was precisely that sense of bewilderment that led some researchers to propose that America, or parts of it, could be the last vestige of Atlantis. The parallels were, at least on the surface, suggestive. Plato spoke of a land that was rich, fertile, full of natural resources, with vast plains, and a society capable of building canals and great hydraulic works. When comparing these descriptions with the Incan agricultural systems or the urban complexity of Teotihuacan, some found it difficult not to draw connections. One of the first to develop this idea in a structured way was Ignatius Donnelly, the same author who, a few decades earlier, had reignited global interest in Atlantis with his book Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. In his work, Donnelly argued that the similarities between the ancient civilizations of the Mediterranean and the pre-Columbian cultures could not be mere coincidence. The existence of pyramids both in Egypt and Mesoamerica, the use of advanced calendar systems, and shared flood myths in both regions were, in his view, evidence of a common origin. But beyond Donnelly, other authors continued to explore this possibility. During the first half of the 20th century, researchers such as Louis Spence and Augustus Le Plongeon proposed even bolder theories. Le Plongeon, for example, claimed that the Mayan culture was a direct heir to Atlantis, and that the Maya not only preserved advanced technological knowledge, but also maintained a spiritual lineage that connected them to that lost people. Some researchers went even further, suggesting that Plato's account had been passed down through generations of Phoenician or Carthaginian sailors who may have reached the American shores in ancient times. According to this perspective, the Egyptians might have heard rumors about a land beyond the ocean, and these stories later made their way to Solon's ears and, eventually, into Plato's texts. In the 1960s, The American Atlantis theory experienced a new wave of interest with the publication of various studies analyzing linguistic and cultural similarities between peoples on both sides of the Atlantic. Some independent researchers argued that certain words, symbols, and social structures shared common traits, which, according to them, reinforced the hypothesis of ancient contact, and by extension, an Atlantean origin. Geography played a significant role in the development of these ideas. Viewed from Europe, the Americas lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules, fulfilling the condition of being on the other side. Furthermore, the continent's massive size matched Plato's figures regarding the extent of Atlantis. Some ancient maps, such as the Piri-Reis map, were interpreted by certain authors as signs that these lands had been known to now vanished civilizations long before Columbus. However, the theory of America as Atlantis also faced clear challenges. The chronology of American civilizations, according to archaeological records, did not align at all with the dates Plato had mentioned. Additionally, the cultural and technological gap between Egypt, Greece, and the pre-Columbian cultures appeared too vast to support the idea of direct influence. The absence of intermediate archaeological remains between Europe and America further complicated the picture. Despite these objections, the theory never fully disappeared. The emotional connection many people felt with the myth of Atlantis and the fascination sparked by the pre-Columbian cultures kept speculation alive. Even today, some authors argue that certain archaeological sites in Mexico, Peru, or Bolivia might be related, directly or indirectly, to the legacy of Atlantis. A recurring example is Tiwanaku in Bolivia. Located more than 3,800 meters above sea level, this ancient city has been seen by some as an archaeological anomaly. Its architectural complexity, the enormous size of its stone blocks, and the precision of its carvings have led more than one researcher to wonder whether Tiwanaku might have some connection to Atlantis. However, official datings place Tiwanaku in a period far more recent than that which would correspond to the mythical sunken continent. Another point of interest has been the Caribbean region. Islands like Cuba and the Bahamas have been explored in search of submerged structures, and on more than one occasion, underwater geological formations have been interpreted as possible remnants of lost cities. Once again, the lack of solid evidence has prevented such hypotheses from being confirmed. What is clear is that the American hypothesis opened a new dimension in the study of the Atlantean myth. It not only questioned traditional locations, but also introduced the possibility that human migrations, intercontinental contact, and large-scale natural catastrophes were more connected than official science had been willing to admit at the time. To this day, the theory of Atlantis in America remains a topic of debate in forums, books, and documentaries. Some view it as a romantic speculation without foundation. Others see it as a possibility still waiting to be explored. But what is undeniable is that this interpretation broadened the field of inquiry and kept the flame of one of humanity's greatest mysteries burning. And just when it seemed that the debate over the geographical location of Atlantis could not become any more complex, an even more ambitious, almost excessive idea emerged. A theory that went far beyond pinpointing a location on the map. A proposal that suggested that Atlantis had not merely been a lost island, but the remote and common origin of all known great civilizations. The mother civilization of humanity. The mother civilization. As the decades passed and theories about Atlantis multiplied like the branches of an uncontrollable tree, an idea emerged that, due to its ambition and scope, surpassed every previous attempt to explain the mystery. It was no longer just about locating a vanished island on a map or linking it to a specific culture. Atlantis was now being seen as something much greater, the original cradle of all the great ancient civilizations. A mother civilization, predating Egypt, Sumer, the Maya, and every other known culture. A civilization that would have planted the seeds of human knowledge before disappearing in a cataclysm that erased nearly all traces of its existence from the face of the earth. The seed of this theory began to sprout in the late 19th century, but it was during the 20th century that it reached its fullest development. Researchers and writers who combined alternative history, speculative archaeology, and a deep interest in ancient enigmas began connecting dots that, at first glance, seemed scattered and unrelated. Pyramids in Egypt, megalithic structures in South America, astronomical alignments at Stonehenge and other parts of Europe, all began to be seen as pieces of a much larger puzzle. A recurring argument was the astonishing similarity that some cultures, separated by thousands of kilometers and insurmountable geographical barriers, showed in essential aspects of their architecture, religion, and worldview. The presence of pyramids, for example, was not limited to Egypt and Mesoamerica. Similar structures had also been built in China and other parts of the world. The coincidences went beyond architecture. Certain deities, solar symbols, and repeated geometric patterns seemed to suggest a shared source of inspiration. Within this framework of thought, Atlantis began to be seen as that nucleus of wisdom that, in a remote past, had radiated knowledge to all corners of the planet. According to this interpretation, after the island's destruction, the survivors embarked on long journeys in various directions, carrying with them the fundamentals of agriculture, writing, astronomy, and monumental engineering. Some researchers, such as Otto Muck, even suggested that the migrations following the sinking of Atlantis were directly responsible for the emergence of advanced cultural centers in places as distant as Egypt, Mesopotamia, or the Indus Valley. Some went as far as to claim that the Olmec civilization, considered by many to be the mother culture of Mesoamerica, may have received Atlantean influence. The mother civilization hypothesis soon incorporated another key element: the flood myths found in various traditions around the world. From the biblical account of the Great Flood to the Sumerian legends of Utnapishtim and the indigenous stories of the Americas and Oceania that speak of oceans destroying everything in their path, many saw in these accounts distorted fragments of the same global tragedy, the disappearance of Atlantis. The coincidences seem to add weight to the theory. The oral transmission of traumatic events across generations could have transformed a specific historical fact into myths dispersed among all ancient cultures. Atlantis, from this perspective, was not just a lost island. It was the origin of the human civilization cycle, a sort of alternative genesis that, for reasons still not fully understood, had been relegated to the realm of myth. Authors like Graham Hancock took these ideas even further. In his influential book, Fingerprints of the Gods, Hancock proposed that an advanced civilization had existed in a remote past, much earlier than conventional archaeology was willing to admit. According to him, the evidence was right in front of the world's eyes. Impossible astronomical alignments in prehistoric monuments, ancient maps that seemed to depict coastlines only visible before the last ice age, and mathematical knowledge too precise for officially primitive cultures. Although the scientific community responded with skepticism, and in many cases with outright rejection, the mother civilization theories continued to gain followers. The idea that humanity had a far more complex and technological past than traditional history books suggested was too captivating to ignore. Moreover, the growing number of archaeological discoveries that were difficult to explain within the conventional framework, such as the Nazca lines, the Ica stones, or the megaliths of Baalbek, served as constant fuel for these hypotheses. Another factor that strengthened the theory was the emergence of studies on ancient natural disasters of global scale. Meteor impacts, abrupt sea level changes, and massive volcanic eruptions began to be documented with increasing accuracy by geologists and paleoclimatologists. These events demonstrated that, in the recent geological history of the Earth, disasters had indeed occurred that were large enough to wipe entire cultures off the map. Thus, little by little, Atlantis went from being a simple mythical island to becoming, for many, the lost cradle of humanity. a mother civilization whose traces may have been scattered across continents and oceans, waiting to be discovered by those willing to look beyond the obvious. But while the theories about the mother civilization continued to grow, there were those who took the story of Atlantis into much darker and more dangerous territory. The ideological manipulation of the myth, its political appropriation, and extremist interpretations began to emerge, giving an unsettling twist to what, up to that point, had been a quest for knowledge. That chapter, which takes us directly to the way the myth was used for ideological purposes during one of the most turbulent periods of the 20th century, is the next step in this journey through the history of Atlantis. The Nazi Appropriation. When Atlantis began to take shape in the popular imagination as the supposed cradle of all civilizations, it did not take long for extreme ideologies to see in it a perfect tool to shape their own narratives. And among all the dark episodes of recent history linked to the myth, none was as disturbing as the one led by the Nazi regime during the first half of the 20th century. Atlantis, which until then had been a source of inspiration for archaeologists, writers, and dreamers, became a dangerous symbol in service of a political project based on racial supremacy. Interwar Germany was immersed in a profound social, economic, and emotional crisis. The defeat in the First World War and the Treaty of Versailles had left the country humiliated and on the brink of collapse. It was in that fertile ground that radical ideologies began to flourish, promising to restore the nation's lost pride. Within this context, the Nazi regime, led by Adolf Hitler, not only designed an unprecedented political and military machine, but also sought to construct a historical narrative that would support its ideas of racial superiority. Atlantis entered the scene as a key element of that narrative. According to some Nazi ideologues, the Atlanteans had been the mother race, an ancestral Aryan civilization whose knowledge, purity, and power had formed the basis of all subsequent cultures. This reinterpretation of the myth did not arise out of nowhere. It was the result of decades of distortions and manipulations of Plato's original story, mixed with elements from theosophy and pseudo-scientific racial theories that had been circulating in Europe since the late 19th century. One of the central figures in this appropriation was Heinrich Himmler, leader of the feared SS, and a fervent believer in the existence of a superior Aryan race. Himmler was convinced that official history had been manipulated to conceal the true origins of the German people. For him, Atlantis was far more than a myth. It was the homeland of the Aryan ancestors, whose descendants had migrated northward into Europe after the island's destruction. To support these ideas, Himmler created in 1935 an organization that would become one of the most unsettling instruments of Nazi propaganda, the Ahnenerbe, whose full name was Deutsche Ahnenerbe Studiengesellschaft für Geistesurgeschichte, meaning German Ancestral Heritage, Research and Teaching Society. Under the guise of a scientific institution, the Ahnenerbe launched archaeological expeditions around the world, funded by the Nazi state, with the goal of finding physical evidence that would demonstrate the existence of a primordial Aryan civilization. The expeditions financed by the Ahnenerbe were highly varied and, in some cases, verged on the absurd. Teams of so-called researchers traveled to remote places such as Tibet, the Caucasus, and North Africa in search of skulls, architectural remains, or ancient inscriptions that could be linked, directly or indirectly, to Atlantis and to Aryan racial supremacy. In many instances, the results were manipulated, or simply fabricated, to fuel propaganda. The obsession reached such an extreme that even within Germany, Himmler ordered excavations in places where, according to him, remnants of the Atlanteans might be found. Regions such as Bavaria or the Alpine foothills became the subjects of pseudo-scientific investigations that blended esoteric rituals, craniometric measurements, and distorted readings of classical texts. One of the most delusional concepts to emerge from this appropriation was the idea that Atlantis had not sunk in a literal sense, but that its legacy survived in the blood of the Germanic peoples. According to this vision, The Aryans were the direct heirs of that civilization, bearers of a superior genetic legacy that needed to be preserved and purified. This belief, deeply embedded in Nazi ideology, served as a justification for exclusionary, discriminatory, and genocidal policies whose horrific consequences are well known. The instrumentalization of the Atlantis myth by the Third Reich went far beyond speeches and books. It was incorporated into SS officer training, propaganda documentaries, and even early childhood education. The idea of a lost and glorious past became an emotional and psychological pillar that fueled extreme nationalism and the German people's sense of historical destiny. But as is often the case with narratives built on lies and manipulation, the house of cards eventually collapsed. With the fall of the Nazi regime in 1945, many of the documents, findings, and studies promoted by the Ahnenerbe were discredited and dismissed as pseudoscience. Some members of the organization were tried during the Nuremberg trials, and the use of the Atlantean myth as an ideological tool was forever stained by the shadow of that dark chapter. The relationship between Atlantis and Nazism remains, to this day, a subject of research and debate. Some scholars analyze how it was possible for a philosophical myth, born from Plato's pen as a moral warning against arrogance and corruption, to be turned into a justification for one of the most destructive ideologies of modern history. What is certain is that, after the end of the Second World War, Atlantis began to slowly shed that ideological burden. New generations of researchers and explorers revisited the topic from more scientific perspectives, or at least from viewpoints far removed from the racial delusions of the 1930s and 1940s. And with the arrival of the second half of the 20th century, a revolutionary new element entered the picture: the development of modern underwater technology. The search for Atlantis was about to change its stage, leaving behind political discourse and entering fully into the world of sonars, submarines, and deep-sea exploration. Modern technology and the underwater search. As the 20th century progressed and technologies once unimaginable became reality, the search for Atlantis entered a new era. Theories, philosophical speculations, and esoteric interpretations continued to circulate through books and conferences. But now, for the first time, humanity had in its hands tools capable of exploring the ocean floor in search of physical evidence. Modern technology offered the possibility of peering beneath the waves with a level of precision never before achieved. Atlantis was no longer solely a matter of imagination. It became a technical challenge. It all began with the first advances in underwater mapping. During the Second World War, the development of sonar, a system based on the propagation of acoustic waves, allowed submarines to detect objects beneath the surface. Although originally designed for military purposes, its post-war civilian application opened a new horizon for oceanography. Scientific expeditions began mapping the seafloor with a level of detail previously unattainable. For the first time, researchers could identify the hidden shapes of underwater mountains, trenches, and plateaus that had remained invisible until then. In the 1950s and 1960s, the first large-scale mapping campaigns of the North Atlantic were carried out. These studies revealed the existence of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, a massive underwater mountain range that spans the ocean from north to south. The news was met with excitement by Atlantis seekers, who saw in that formation a potential geological clue pointing to an ancient landmass that may have once emerged from the sea. The idea that Atlantis might be located in that region gained new momentum. The advances did not stop with maps. The invention and refinement of manned submersibles, such as the famous Alvin, which was capable of descending to great depths, allowed researchers to directly observe the ocean floor. In 1964, Alvin became one of the first vessels to explore the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, confirming its tectonic origin. Although some unusually shaped rock formations were found, none appeared to be of artificial origin. During those same years, the development of underwater photography and video recording revolutionized the way discoveries were documented. For the first time, images of submerged structures, often naturally formed, were brought to the general public through documentaries and television programs. The excitement of seeing the ocean floor, once entirely unreachable, reignited hope of finding the mythical lost island. One of the most attention-grabbing areas was the region of the Bahamas, especially around the island of Bimini. In 1968, a group of divers discovered a linear rock formation that has since been known as the Bimini Road. Seen from above, the structure appeared to be a road or wall composed of large, tightly fitted stone blocks. The photographs, published in the media at the time, caused a true sensation. For many, this was the first tangible proof of Atlantis' existence. The discovery was quickly linked to the predictions of Edgar Cayce, who, decades earlier, had claimed that remnants of Atlantis would be found near Bimini by the end of the 1960s. The coincidence of dates only heightened the anticipation. However, when geologists and geomorphology experts studied the formation, they concluded that it was a natural phenomenon, resulting from the fracturing and erosion of limestone under specific marine conditions. Despite the scientific conclusions, the Bimini discovery remains, even today, a recurring argument among those who believe in Atlantis' existence. Images of those submerged blocks continue to appear in books, reports, and documentaries about the Atlantean mystery. With the arrival of the satellite era and new remote sensing technologies, the possibilities for exploration increased exponentially. Satellites capable of accurately measuring seafloor topography began providing global maps. Thanks to them, dozens of underwater formations were identified in different parts of the Atlantic and Mediterranean, each at some point considered a possible location for Atlantis. The use of magnetometers and ground-penetrating radar also allowed scientists to analyze marine sediments in search of buried structures. Some anomalies detected on the ocean floor, particularly near the Azores, generated sensational headlines in the media, but so far, none have turned out to be evidence of a sunken city. 21st century technology has taken the search to a new level. Autonomous underwater vehicles, capable of exploring hard-to-reach areas, are providing high-resolution images of the seabed. Robots equipped with manipulator arms and cutting-edge cameras have reached places no human had ever been before. And although large areas of the Atlantic have been scanned, the vastness of the ocean continues to hold secrets that science has yet to uncover. Explorations have also been conducted in other regions, such as the Gulf of Cadiz, where in 2011, an international team of archaeologists and oceanographers detected what appeared to be geometric formations underwater. Sonar images showed patterns reminiscent of urban structures. Although the discovery generated striking headlines in the press, later analysis was more cautious. Most specialists concluded that what had been found could be the result of natural geological processes. Nevertheless, the researchers leading the expedition did not rule out further study in the future. Beyond the specific results, it is clear that modern technology has forever transformed the search for Atlantis. What was once a journey for adventurers or the dream of writers is now a challenge involving geologists, oceanographers, engineers, and scientists from various disciplines. Each new expedition, each new image of the ocean floor, adds another piece to this immense puzzle. And yet, despite all the deployed technology, Atlantis has still not been found. Perhaps deep down that is precisely why we keep searching. The certainty that no matter how far our knowledge and tools advance, the mystery remains intact. But there is another perspective worth exploring. One that looks to the forces of nature and suggests that perhaps Atlantis was not a single civilization, but rather the sum of many disasters that humanity faced, and that, over time, merged into a single legend. That will be the next step in our journey through the history of Atlantis. The mark of natural disasters. As the years went by and technology continued to push the boundaries of marine exploration, a new approach began gaining traction among researchers who were not satisfied with a single explanation for the mystery of Atlantis. Gradually, an idea began to emerge, one that, rather than seeking a specific location for the mythical island, focused on a much deeper and more universal aspect: the memory of natural disasters. The theory proposed that the myth of Atlantis could be the sum of memories of catastrophes, accumulated over centuries and transformed into legend through the oral traditions of various cultures. Planet Earth has always been the stage for sudden and violent changes. Earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, and tectonic movements have reshaped continents and coastlines throughout history. Each of these events has left indelible scars not only on the geography, but also on the minds of the populations that lived through them. And when an entire community vanishes overnight, what remains as testimony are stories, legends, and warnings passed down from generation to generation. One of the clearest examples is the case of Santorini, the ancient Thera. We have already seen how that volcanic eruption may have served as direct or indirect inspiration for Plato's tale. But the Mediterranean has witnessed many more tragedies of that magnitude. The Black Sea Basin, for instance, was the scene of a catastrophic flood more than 7,000 years ago. According to various geological studies, this body of water transitioned from being a freshwater lake to becoming a saltwater sea when the Mediterranean broke through the Bosporus Strait. The rise in water levels was so rapid and devastating that human settlements in the area were submerged within weeks. For those who experienced it, it must have felt like the end of the known world. Throughout human memory, stories of great floods have been deeply ingrained, like the one found in the Bible or the Sumerian tablets of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Curiously, cultures completely isolated from one another, from the Americas to Asia, have legends of massive floods that swept across the earth, forcing their people to seek refuge in the highlands or to build vessels in order to survive. Could all these stories be echoes of the same global phenomenon? Or are we looking at a convergence of scattered memories that, over the centuries, merged into the Atlantis myth? We also cannot ignore the role that tsunamis have played in the construction of these narratives. One of the most well-documented in historical times was the tsunami triggered by the Lisbon earthquake in 1755. The massive waves generated by that seismic event not only destroyed the Portuguese capital, but also affected much of the Atlantic coastline, reaching as far as the British Isles and North Africa. Chronicles describe how the sea suddenly receded, exposing the seabed, only to return with devastating force. It is not hard to imagine how such an event, in ancient times and without any written record, could have inspired legends of cities swallowed by the ocean. More recently, the eruption of Krakatoa in 1883 showed the modern world that a single volcanic event can alter the global climate, darken the skies for months, and generate waves capable of destroying entire populations. The magnitude of that disaster, widely documented, serves as a reminder of how vulnerable a civilization can be in the face of nature's power. And if we look further back in time, the geological record tells us of countless localized extinction events, meteorite impacts, like the one that formed the Chicxulub crater millions of years ago, or massive underwater landslides capable of triggering gigantic tsunamis, are examples of how Earth can radically change in a matter of minutes. Within this context, some geologists and archaeologists began to suggest that the myth of Atlantis might actually be a kind of geological collective memory, a narrative woven from dozens of natural disasters, collected by different cultures and passed down orally until eventually recorded in writing by Plato. According to this interpretation, Atlantis was never a specific place, but rather the symbolic representation of a deep and universal fear, the fear of losing everything in an instant without being able to do anything to stop it. The psychology of myth also supports this possibility. The human mind tends to search for patterns, to create explanations, to find meaning in chaos. And when a people suffer sudden destruction, the story that emerges is rarely limited to the bare facts. It gets amplified, embellished, mixed with other similar tales. As generations pass, that story stops being a simple account and becomes a legend capable of crossing centuries and continents. Current research into paleotsunamis and paleoseismic events has revealed that many coastal regions around the world have experienced, in the past, catastrophes far greater in scope than previously believed. Traces of marine sediments in areas now far from the sea, layers of ash in distant geological strata, and structures destroyed by seemingly inexplicable causes are just some of the clues pointing to a geological past much more violent than was accepted for decades. This approach, far from stripping the Atlantis story of its mystery, actually enriches it. Because while it may be true that we will never find a sunken island exactly as Plato described it, the reality is that humanity has lived through, and will continue to live through, events that fully justify the birth of myths like this one. And just when it seemed that all explanations could fit within the bounds of the known and the natural, an even more provocative theory emerged. One that looks far beyond the oceans and beyond documented human history. A hypothesis that places Atlantis under the shadow of the unknown, suggesting that perhaps its origins were not of this world. Because now it is time to talk about an approach that reaches far beyond geology or archaeology, the possible extraterrestrial influence behind the myth of Atlantis. The Extraterrestrial Hypothesis. On this journey through the history of the Atlantis myth, we have followed a path that led us from the pages of Plato to marine geology laboratories, from the halls of Renaissance philosophers to the depths of the ocean scanned by state-of-the-art sonar. And just when it seemed that all explanations remained within the realm of archaeology, geology, or mythology, a theory emerged that would take the discussion to a completely different level. A hypothesis that, for many, bordered on the edge of credibility, yet despite that, began to gain followers in the second half of the 20th century. The possibility that Atlantis was a civilization of extraterrestrial origin, or at the very least, a culture deeply influenced by visitors from other worlds. This interpretation began to gain traction alongside the rise of the UFO phenomenon. In the years following World War II, the appearance of unidentified flying objects across various parts of the world, mass sightings, and reports of encounters with beings of non-human appearance became part of the public conversation. It was then that some researchers and writers began to draw connections between ancient legends and these new phenomena. And as might be expected, Atlantis held a prominent place in those connections. One of the pioneers of this line of thought was Erich von Däniken, author of the controversial book Chariots of the Gods, published in 1968. Although Däniken did not focus exclusively on Atlantis, he opened a door that many others would explore in greater detail. The idea that, in ancient times, Earth was visited by extraterrestrial civilizations that left their mark on the architecture, technology, and astronomical knowledge of various ancient peoples. Atlantis, within this perspective, began to be seen as a possible enclave created or overseen by these visitors. According to this hypothesis, the Atlanteans were the direct heirs of these beings from the stars. Hence their apparent technological superiority, their ability to construct monumental works, and their mastery of energies unknown to the cultures that surrounded them. Some authors even suggested that the source of Atlantis's power came from large energy crystals, capable of capturing and amplifying energy from the cosmos. This idea, though lacking any scientific foundation, was enthusiastically embraced by those seeking explanations beyond conventional boundaries. Plato's descriptions of the wealth and technology of Atlantis were reinterpreted through this lens. Flying machines, energy weapons, and glass domes mentioned in some later esoteric texts were seen as veiled references to alien technology. Even the supposed psychic abilities of the Atlanteans, frequently mentioned by early 20th century esoteric movements, were reimagined as telepathic communication skills or mental control derived from their contact with beings from other planets. Literature and cinema also played a part in feeding this vision. Science fiction films, alternative theory documentaries, and pseudoscientific research books began presenting Atlantis as a technological hub comparable to what we would today consider an extraterrestrial base on Earth. Some writers went even further and proposed that the destruction of Atlantis was not simply a natural disaster, but a high-tech war that ended with the total annihilation of the island, a kind of atomic apocalypse that occurred thousands of years before our era. Another point that reinforced these speculations was the growing interest in archaeological anomalies scattered across the globe. Megaliths seemingly impossible to move with the technology known in antiquity, perfect astronomical alignments in prehistoric monuments, and legends of gods descending from the sky appeared, in the eyes of extraterrestrial hypothesis defenders, to be scattered pieces of a single puzzle. Atlantis, seen through this lens, was just one more of those pieces, perhaps even the most important one. Some alternative researchers also pointed to the similarity between the stories of Atlantis' destruction and the warnings from certain ancient cultures about previous civilizations that were punished for their arrogance and misuse of knowledge. The symbolic reading of these legends led to the idea that perhaps the Atlanteans, in their attempt to equal or surpass their extraterrestrial mentors, had triggered a catastrophe that not only destroyed their world, but also served as a lesson for future human generations. Naturally, the mainstream scientific community categorically rejected these interpretations. There was, and still is, no empirical evidence to support the intervention of extraterrestrial civilizations in early human development. But that did not stop the theory from continuing to gain followers. Publications dedicated to historical enigmas, television programs focused on lost civilizations, and the growing interest in the paranormal helped to cement this hypothesis firmly in the collective imagination. In recent years, the popularity of series such as Ancient Aliens has rekindled interest in this kind of theory. Atlantis continues to occupy a central role in that narrative, not just as a vanished civilization, but as a symbol of forbidden knowledge, ancient power, and the connection between humanity and the mysteries of the cosmos. And perhaps that is one of the reasons why Atlantis continues to fascinate. Its ability to adapt, to transform, to embrace every new current of thought, no matter how extreme or unlikely. The truth is that, regardless of its origin, Atlantis is no longer merely a place. It is a concept, a metaphor for what once was and what might be again. And so, while the extraterrestrial theory continues to spark heated debates, the myth of Atlantis keeps extending its roots into popular culture. Books, films, comics, television series, and video games have all played their part in keeping the legend alive, bringing it to audiences of all ages and generations. That, precisely, will be our next destination, to explore how Atlantis, beyond philosophical texts and archaeological excavations, has managed to conquer the world of cinema and literature. Atlantis in film and literature. Over the centuries, Atlantis has shown an extraordinary ability to adapt to each era, transforming itself into a mirror of humanity's fears, dreams, and aspirations. And if there is one area where this flexibility has become especially evident, it is in popular culture. From early adventure novels to Hollywood blockbusters, Atlantis has lived countless lives on the pages of literature and on the screens of film and television. Its ability to reinvent itself has been so remarkable that, at this point, it is difficult to find someone who has not heard of the mythical island, even if they have never read Plato. The journey of Atlantis in literature began long before the age of cinema. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, authors like Jules Verne and Arthur Conan Doyle began to incorporate the myth into their adventure stories. Verne, in his novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, briefly mentions Atlantis during the Nautilus's explorations, hinting at the existence of submerged ruins that the enigmatic Captain Nemo seemed to know all too well. Doyle, better known for his Sherlock Holmes stories, flirted in some of his short tales with the idea of lost civilizations that could be linked to the Atlantean myth. But it was in the decades that followed when Atlantis began to take center stage in literary works. Writers like Pierre Benoit, with his novel L'Atlantide, published in 1911, took things a step further by creating stories in which the echoes of the lost civilization were essential to the plot. Benoit's novel, set in the Sahara Desert, describes the discovery of a civilization that supposedly survived the destruction of Atlantis, blending exoticism, mystery, and romance in a formula that captivated thousands of readers in its time. By the 20th century, science fiction and fantasy literature had eagerly embraced the myth. Atlantis began to appear in settings ranging from space operas to archaeological adventures. Authors such as H.P. Lovecraft incorporated it into their personal mythologies, linking it with other lost cities and pre-human civilizations. The image of Atlantis became part of a broader imagination where the cosmic, the forbidden, and the ancient merged into one. And while literature continued exploring different facets of the myth, cinema did the same, with the advantage of having a visual language capable of giving physical form to that island so often imagined. One of the first films to tackle the subject was Atlantis, The Lost Continent, released in 1961. This production, directed by George Pal, combined elements of classical epic with science fiction, portraying an Atlantis populated by an advanced society, endowed with unknown technology, and ultimately destroyed by its own arrogance. From that point on, cinematic portrayals of Atlantis began to multiply. Each decade brought its own version, adapting the myth to the tastes of the time. In the 1970s, Atlantis appeared in low-budget films where adventure, sea monsters, and impossible technologies were blended together. In the 1980s and 1990s, mainstream cinema leaned toward more visually striking approaches, making full use of the possibilities offered by special effects. One of the most memorable depictions came in 2001, when Disney released Atlantis, The Lost Empire. The film, directed by Gary Trousdale and Kirk Wise, presented a steampunk-style Atlantis, full of impossible machines, floating cities, and technological secrets. Aimed at a family audience, the film combined action, humor, and a storyline that mixed archaeology, science fiction, and classic adventure. Although it was not a huge box office success, over time it has become a cult classic, especially among those who grew up dreaming of lost civilizations. Television also played its part. Documentaries produced by networks such as History Channel or National Geographic have dedicated countless hours to theories about the location of Atlantis, often mixing scientific data with pure speculation. Mystery and unexplained phenomena programs regularly included the topic in their broadcasts, making the myth a recurring element of television programming for decades. And if we step into the world of comics, the list grows even longer. In the Marvel Comics universe, Atlantis is the underwater kingdom ruled by Namor the Submariner, one of the publisher's earliest superheroes. DC Comics, on the other hand, has its own version of Atlantis, ruled by Aquaman. Both interpretations portray Atlantis as a technologically advanced civilization, isolated from the rest of the world and with a long history of conflicts and tragedies. Video games have also not remained immune to this ancient allure. Titles such as Tomb Raider, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, or even Age of Mythology have included references or entire levels dedicated to Atlantis, taking advantage of its symbolic power and potential as an adventure setting. The combination of exploration, mystery, and forgotten technology fits perfectly with the dynamics of action and strategy games. In contemporary literature, Atlantis remains a recurring theme in mystery and archaeology novels. Authors such as Clive Cussler, with his series starring Dirk Pitt, have written entire plots around the search for Atlantis, blending action, international conspiracies, and archaeological discoveries. Other writers have taken the myth into more fantastical territories, creating underground Atlantises, Atlanteans who have survived in secret, or descendant civilizations that still influence the course of humanity. What is fascinating about this entire cultural production is that, despite the differences in approach, one element remains constant: fascination. Atlantis continues to be an inexhaustible source of inspiration, a mythical place that allows screenwriters, novelists, and game designers to explore themes as diverse as corruption, power, ambition, or the search for lost truth. And perhaps the most curious part is that the more Atlantis appears in film, literature, or entertainment, the more blurred the line between myth and reality becomes. Many people, especially younger generations, first encounter Atlantis through these cultural representations, long before approaching Plato's original text. For them, the Lost Island is not merely a philosophical passage, but an entire universe of adventures, mysteries, and spectacular settings. In a way, the myth has transcended its origin, reinventing itself again and again to remain relevant. And while popular culture continues to explore new ways of telling its story, researchers, archaeologists, and adventurers still embark on real-world expeditions in search of concrete clues. Because beyond fiction, the search for Atlantis continues. And in recent years, some expeditions have promised to reveal discoveries that, if confirmed, could forever change what we believe we know about this ancient enigma. Recent expeditions. Despite the centuries that have passed since Plato wrote his dialogues, the search for Atlantis is more alive than ever. With each new generation of researchers, archaeologists, geologists, and adventurers, the hope of finding concrete evidence of the mythical island is renewed. In recent years, this interest has been accompanied by technological advances that have allowed exploration to reach levels that once seemed unattainable. These modern expeditions represent the perfect blend of historical romanticism and modern science, of fascination with myth and the rigor of investigation. One of the locations that has drawn the most attention in the past decade is the Gulf of Cadiz, on the southwestern coast of Spain. There, in the marshlands of Doñana, a team of archaeologists led by Richard Freund and backed by the University of Hartford carried out a series of studies beginning in 2009. Using technologies such as ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, and microwave scanning, the team identified what appeared to be geometric structures buried beneath layers of sediment. The patterns they discovered resembled Plato's descriptions, concentric rings and rectangular zones that, at first glance, could be interpreted as the remains of a sunken city or one buried by the passage of time. Freund and his team proposed that these formations could be part of Atlantis, or at least of a city inspired by it. The evidence was not sufficient to make a definitive claim, but the discovery caused a media sensation. Television programs, documentaries, and science magazines echoed the news, fueling the eternal debate between those who support and those who reject the existence of Atlantis. Another hotspot for investigation has been the Azores region. Thanks to improvements in side-scan sonar systems and the use of autonomous underwater vehicles, teams of scientists have been able to map large areas of the seafloor in search of structural anomalies. Some of these studies have detected formations that, in photographs, show straight lines and 90-degree angles, features that often raise suspicions of human intervention. However, to date, the most rigorous analyses suggest that these formations are of geological origin. The Caribbean has also been the scene of recent investigations. Off the coast of Cuba, in the early 2000s, a Canadian-Cuban team led by Paulina Zelitsky announced the discovery, using deep-sea sonar, of what appeared to be rectangular and pyramidal structures about 700 meters below sea level. The images obtained showed geometric shapes that were quickly interpreted by some as the remains of a lost civilization. However, due to the depth and technical difficulty of excavating in that area, the investigation was suspended, and to this day, the artificial nature of those structures has not been confirmed. Meanwhile, exploration of the Mediterranean has continued steadily. The seafloor between Greece and Crete remains a focus of analysis, particularly in areas near Santorini. International teams have conducted geophysical studies to better understand the evolution of the underwater topography following the eruption of Thera. Although these investigations have provided valuable data about the geological history of the region, none have yielded definitive evidence of the existence of Atlantis. What is fascinating about all these expeditions is that, beyond their concrete results, they have made it clear that the ocean floor remains one of the least explored territories on the planet. It is estimated that more than 80% of the world's oceans have only been superficially mapped. This means that vast areas of the seabed could still be hiding unknown formations, whether natural or man-made. Technology continues to advance, and in recent years, new three-dimensional scanning systems have been developed, capable of providing much more detailed images than those obtained with earlier technologies. In addition, Earth observation satellites are beginning to use sensors that can detect subtle variations in the density of underwater materials, which could facilitate the identification of archaeological remains buried beneath layers of sediment. Even artificial intelligence has begun to play a role in the search for Atlantis. Data analysis algorithms are being trained to identify anomalous patterns in large oceanographic databases. This allows researchers to detect in a matter of minutes what once would have taken years of manual review. On the other hand, some private expeditions, funded by patrons, foundations, or even enthusiasts of alternative archaeology, continue to organize search missions in strategically selected locations. The coasts of Morocco, the Canary Islands, the Mid-Atlantic, and the Caribbean remain areas where dives, sampling, and underwater analyses are carried out each year. Nonetheless, the academic community remains cautious. Most scientists specializing in marine geology and underwater archaeology insist that, to this day, there is no irrefutable evidence proving the existence of Atlantis as described by Plato. And while they acknowledge that popular interest in the subject has helped fund numerous investigations that would not have been possible otherwise, they warn that it is essential to distinguish between actual discoveries and imaginative interpretations. Even so, optimism persists. Many current explorers argue that, given the technological limitations that still exist when it comes to exploring certain ocean zones, it is possible that the definitive discovery is still waiting, buried beneath layers of sediment or hidden in deep areas that have yet to be mapped with sufficient resolution. What is indisputable is that the myth of Atlantis continues to inspire research teams across the globe. Scientists, archaeologists, and mystery enthusiasts continue to embark on adventures, equipped with the most modern technology but also with the same passion that, centuries ago, led so many others to search for the impossible. And thus, we arrive at the point where all theories, all expeditions, and all interpretations converge. The moment to ask ourselves why, after more than 2,000 years, we remain so fascinated by this story. What it is that makes Atlantis stay alive in our collective imagination, generation after generation. That will be precisely the final destination of this journey, to understand why, beyond maps and excavations, Atlantis has never truly disappeared from our memory. Atlantis, the immortal myth. More than 2 millennia have passed since Plato, in the quiet of his academy in Athens, first wrote about Atlantis. Over 2,000 years since that story, combining philosophy, moral warning, and mystery, was etched into the collective memory of humanity. And yet here we are, still wondering where it was, what it was, and why it disappeared. Atlantis has defied the passage of time like few other myths, and its ability to survive the changes of era, mindset, and scientific paradigms is, in itself, a phenomenon worthy of study. What began as a passage within a philosophical dialogue ended up transforming into one of the great universal enigmas. Atlantis no longer belongs solely to Greek philosophy, nor even to archaeology or history. It has become part of our cultural identity, a sort of empty space that each generation fills with its own questions, fears, and dreams. Perhaps that is why it is so difficult to abandon it, or to declare it a closed and outdated myth. At its core, Atlantis represents something much deeper than a vanished island. It is the symbol of lost potential, of what could have been, and for unknown reasons, vanished, leaving behind only an echo. In every archaeological dig, in every theory, in every underwater expedition, there is more than just a desire to find stones or ruins. There is an emotional need to discover that, somewhere on this planet, a trace remains of a civilization that once reached a level of splendor we have not yet matched. Atlantis also reflects a constant in human nature, the fear of decline and the desire to warn ourselves about the dangers of arrogance and pride. Plato made this very clear in his original account. Atlantis was destroyed not only by natural forces, but as punishment for its moral corruption and excessive power. That idea, so simple yet so powerful, still resonates today with the same force as it did then. Because deep down we all understand that greatness without limits and without responsibility can end in tragedy. The myth's endurance is also deeply tied to the way humans perceive the past. We possess an almost instinctive fascination with vanished civilizations. We are drawn to the idea of cultures that, despite their advancement, succumbed to forces they could not control. We like to believe there was a time in history when everything was different, more refined, more spiritual, or more wise. And Atlantis embodies that longing to rediscover a lost golden age. Moreover, the absence of certainties has allowed the myth to be reinterpreted again and again, adapting to each era and context. In the 19th century, it was seen as a subject of scientific exploration. In the 20th, as a source of inspiration for film, literature, and alternative archaeology. In the 21st, it lives on both in conspiracy theories and in oceanography labs, where researchers analyze the seafloor hoping to detect an anomaly that will once again ignite the thrill of the unknown. And although science has dismantled many of the proposed locations, and most of the supposed discoveries have turned out to be natural formations or simple geological misunderstandings, the desire to believe persists. There is something in the myth that connects us to the deepest part of our human condition, the need to find answers to questions that have gone unanswered for centuries. In some way, Atlantis acts as a mirror where we project our own uncertainties and hopes. The globalization of information has made the search for Atlantis a phenomenon shared on a global scale. Thanks to the internet, any discovery, no matter how small, spreads within hours, fueling debate and keeping the interest alive. Online forums, documentaries, newly published books, and even video games continue to present new theories and possible scenarios, keeping the flame burning. And perhaps it has never been about finding it. Maybe the true value of Atlantis lies in the search itself, in that continuous exercise of imagination, investigation, and reflection on who we are and where we come from. Because every time someone decides to study an ancient map, organize an expedition, or write a book on the subject, Atlantis comes to life again. Not as a physical place, but as a universal need to understand the past in order to make sense of the present. What has become clear after centuries of debate is that Atlantis is not just an island that may or may not have existed. It is a symbol, a reminder that even the most powerful civilizations are vulnerable, that knowledge and technology, no matter how advanced, do not guarantee the immortality of a people. It warns us against unchecked pride, but also invites us to keep exploring, questioning, and dreaming. For all these reasons, even if science continues to insist there is no proof, and even if archaeology urges caution, the myth of Atlantis will endure. It will drift between the mists of history, the pages of books and cinema screens, nautical charts, and the dreams of those who, generation after generation, refuse to accept that the greatest mystery of humanity may remain unsolved. Perhaps that is, after all, its true immortality. And so, after this long journey through centuries of history, mystery, and theory, it is clear that the myth of Atlantis will continue to accompany us, fueling our curiosity and our desire to keep exploring the secrets of the past. If you found this journey interesting and would like to discover more stories like this one, you can support the channel by subscribing, leaving a like, and sharing the video with other lovers of humanity's greatest enigmas. Thank you for joining me once again. And as always, good night.